I stood inside the historic inn in Savannah, Georgia, smoothing down my Navy rehearsal dress, when my 40-year-old daughter, Vanessa, slammed a folded document beside my plate. 75 friends and relatives immediately stopped talking. The room fell dead silent. "Cancel your wedding," Vanessa demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Give me your $70,000. You're 67 years old. Mom, you don't need a second marriage or a house in the historic district. My husband needs that capital to salvage his shipping firm before Monday. Or we lose everything. I didn't blink. I'm Margaret Stanton. I ran a successful restoration hardware supply shop for 3 decades after my first husband passed away. I know the value of $1, and I know when someone is trying to bully me. My fiancé, Arthur, sat next to me, his hand resting calmly over mine. We had built this life together, brick by brick. I picked up the paper, tore it down the middle without reading it, and set the pieces back on the linen tablecloth. "No, Vanessa," I said softly. Vanessa's face contorted with rage. She grabbed a mug of warm roast coffee from the table and threw it directly into my face. Liquid splashed across my eyes, soaking my collar and staining my dress. The room gasped. Look what you made me do," she shrieked, waiting for me to break down. I wiped the dampness from my cheek with a napkin. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stared at her, realizing that 30 years of rescuing her had brought us to this exact second. Before anyone could move, the heavy double doors opened. My attorney, David Vance, walked in carrying a thick manila folder. He glanced at my stained dress, then looked at my daughter. "Margaret," David said calmly, "the morning filings are complete. They need to hear this now." What was inside that folder? And how did a mother-daughter relationship fracture so completely? To understand why Vanessa felt entitled to my life savings, you have to look at the last decade. When my late husband died, Vanessa convinced herself that my home, my business savings, and my independence were community property meant to cushion her failures. Her husband, Julian, ran a boutique logistics outfit that constantly hovered on the edge of bankruptcy. Every 2 or 3 years, a new emergency surfaced: a tax lien, a defaulted lease, a failed expansion. And every single time, Vanessa would arrive at my porch, weeping about family duty and her children's future. I paid. I quietly covered 5-figure shortfalls, paid off credit cards, and handed over cash under the guise of temporary family loans. I thought I was protecting my daughter. In reality, I was enabling a lifestyle built on sand. When I retired at 65, I sold my commercial warehouse space, paid off my remaining debts, and kept $70,000 in a high-yield account reserved specifically for my future. I met Arthur a year later, a retired structural engineer who respected my independence and never asked me for a dime. When Arthur and I announced our wedding, Vanessa's attitude shifted from subtle guilt-tripping to open hostility. In her mind, every dollar spent on a caterer, a venue, or a new life with Arthur was $70,000 stolen from her inheritance. 3 weeks before the rehearsal dinner, Julian's business account was frozen over unpaid vendor contracts. Instead of downsizing their suburban house or selling their luxury SUVs, Vanessa decided my wedding budget was the simplest exit strategy. She began calling my vendors, impersonating me, trying to cancel bookings to force refunds directly into her bank account. I caught it early because the inn coordinator knew me personally and flagged the suspicious phone calls. I immediately locked down every contract with a private passcode. Vanessa realized brute force was her only option left. She assumed that confronting me in front of 75 influential guests would force me to surrender out of pure embarrassment. She mistook my quiet nature for weakness. In the ballroom, the silence felt heavy. Coffee dripped from the hem of my dress onto the hardwood floor. My daughter stood over me, her chest heaving, her hands trembling with misplaced indignation. Julian sat 2 seats down, staring at his shoes, refusing to meet anyone's eye. He knew what Vanessa was doing. He had counted on it. "You've always been selfish, Mom," Vanessa hissed, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "You hoard your money while your own grandchildren face uncertainty. Dad would be ashamed of you." I stood up slowly, taking the cloth napkin to wipe the last drops of coffee from my collar. I looked around the room. Relatives, old friends, and former business associates were all watching. "Your father built his business on accountability." "Vanessa," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "He never asked anyone else to pay for his gambles." "You're throwing away your family for a man you met 2 years ago," she barked back, gesturing wildly at Arthur. Arthur remained seated, perfectly composed. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "your mother isn't throwing anything away. You are pushing her." "Stay out of this," she snapped. She turned back to me, lowering her voice to a poison whisper. "Sign the authorization line on the backup copy, or I will make sure every person in Savannah knows you abandoned your daughter." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized I didn't care about her threats anymore. The fear of public embarrassment that had governed my choices for 15 years simply evaporated. "David," I said, turning to my lawyer standing by the doorway. "Open the folder." Vanessa's eyes flicked to the paper stack in David's hands. For the first time that evening, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She thought David was there to finalize her loan. She had no idea what I had actually arranged that morning. David pulled out a stapled financial summary and stepped toward the head table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Over the last 4 years," David announced clearly to the room, "Margaret Stanton has transferred $92,000 directly into Julian and Vanessa's personal accounts to satisfy private debts. Each transfer was documented as a personal loan." A murmuring wave ripples through the guests. Vanessa's mother-in-law, sitting at a table near the center, gasped softly. "That's private," Vanessa shouted, her face turning crimson. "How dare you discuss our private matters in front of guests? You chose this audience." "Vanessa," I reminded her smoothly, "you wanted an audience when you asked for my money. You can keep them while we discuss where it went," David continued, flipping a page. 6 months ago, Vanessa accessed Margaret's secondary business account using an outdated signatory card from the warehouse sale. She withdrew $15,000 without authorization. Julian's head snapped up. "What, Vanessa? You said that was an advance from your mother." Vanessa froze. She looked at her husband, then back at the lawyer. The lie was exposed right there on the table. She hadn't just begged for money. She had actively siphoned it behind her husband's back to cover her own personal credit cards. "I was going to put it back," Vanessa stammered, her composure rapidly unraveling. "It was a temporary fix." "You didn't put it back," I said. "You used it for a down payment on a European cruise while telling your husband that I refused to help you." The room went cold. Relatives who had been looking at me with unspoken judgment moments earlier now turned their gaze directly onto Vanessa. The narrative she had carefully spun that I was a cold, withholding mother. Hoard funds had shattered in less than 2 minutes. "What did you do this morning?" Mom Vanessa demanded, her voice cracking slightly as she eyed the remaining documents in David's folder. David pulled out a blue-bound legal document bearing fresh state stamps. This morning, David explained, Margaret formally dissolved the family trust attached to her home on Bull Street. She also revoked the power of attorney granted to Vanessa 6 years ago. Vanessa took a step back, hitting the edge of her chair. You can't dissolve the trust. That house is supposed to pass to me. It was my house, I corrected her firmly. Your father and I paid the mortgage for 30 years. I maintained the property, paid the property taxes, and covered the insurance while you lived in the guest cottage rent-free for 3 years. I'm your daughter, and I am an adult who owns her property, I replied. This morning, I signed a land deed transferring ownership of the Bull Street property into a private life estate structure. The property is now fully managed by an independent estate corporate trustee. It cannot be leveraged, borrowed against, or sold by anyone outside the trust, including you. Julian stood up, his face pale. Wait. We listed the Bull Street property as secondary equity on our business credit line last month. Vanessa said you signed the release. David looked directly at Julian. Then I suggest you check your corporate filings. Julian. Because if Vanessa presented a signature for Margaret on a secondary equity release, it was unauthorized. The trustee notified your lender's legal department at 9 o'clock this morning. Julian turned to his wife. Absolute panic in his eyes. Vanessa, what did you sign? Vanessa couldn't answer. She reached out, grabbing a chair back to steady herself, the bravado completely gone from her posture. She had built a fortress out of my silence, and I had just stripped away every brick. The ballroom descended into low, furious hushes. Friends were whispering, and Julian was arguing heatedly with Vanessa near the side doors. You told me, your mother agreed, Julian hissed, his hands flying up in frustration. The lender is going to freeze our equipment leases by midnight. I was trying to save your company, Vanessa yelled back, forgetting entirely that 75 people were listening to every word. If she had just given us the $70,000 tonight, we could have cleared the credit line before the audit flagged it. I watched them turn on each other with a strange sense of detachment. For years, I had stressed myself to illness, trying to keep their marriage stable and their finances afloat. I had believed that if I stopped giving, I would be failing as a mother. Standing there with coffee dripping down my dress, I realized the truth. You cannot save people from consequences they actively create. Aunt Clara, my late husband's sister, stood up from her table and walked over to me. She handed me a fresh napkin from her purse and laid a gentle hand on my shoulder. I'm sorry, Margaret, Clara murmured softly. We had no idea she was doing this to you. She told the whole family you were suffering from early memory loss and losing control of your accounts. I looked at Clara, a bitter smile touching my lips. She needed a reason why I stopped writing checks. Clara, it was easier to tell you I was incompetent than to admit I finally said no. David placed the final document on the table in front of Vanessa. This is a formal notice of severance, David stated calmly. Margaret has settled all outstanding utility liabilities for the cottage. You have 30 days to clear your belongings from the Bull Street property. The locks will be changed tomorrow at noon. Vanessa stared at the severance notice like it was written in a foreign language. Her eyes darted from the paper to my face, looking for the soft, compliant mother she had manipulated for decades. Mom, please, she whispered, her voice finally losing its angry edge, replacing it with a desperation that felt entirely hollow. You can't kick us out. Where are we supposed to go? You have a 5-bedroom house in the suburbs. Vanessa, I said, evenly. You don't need my guest cottage. You never did. You kept it to keep a foothold in my life. I'm your only child, she cried, tears finally spilling over her cheeks, not tears of regret, but tears of lost control. How can you walk out on me like this right before your wedding? I looked at the coffee stain on my front bodice, then down at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. I'm not walking out on you, Vanessa, I told her quietly. I'm walking out of the role you assigned me. I am done being your financial cushion. I turned to Arthur. He stood up, picked up my handbag, and offered me his arm. I took it, holding my head high as we moved toward the exit. As we passed the head table, Julian stepped into the aisle, looking broken. Margaret, is there any way to delay the lender notification? Just a few days. I paused, looking at my son-in-law. Julian, you are 42 years old. If your business cannot survive without taking unauthorized loans against your mother-in-law's home, then your business has already failed. Address it now, or it will address you later. We walked out of the ballroom, leaving the whispers, the papers, and the shattered illusions behind us. The next afternoon, the sun broke through the Spanish moss hanging over the courtyard of the historic chapel. I stood in the bride's dressing room, wearing a simple, elegant ivory lace gown. My best friend, Evelyn, adjusted my veil while Arthur waited downstairs with the pastor. There were no coffee stains, no shouting, and no demands. At 2 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the vanity table. It was a text message from Julian's brother. Julian filed for corporate restructuring this morning. Vanessa is staying at a hotel. She tried to come to the chapel an hour ago, but the security officers you placed at the gate turned her away. I set the phone back down, face down. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel hatred. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of relief. 10 minutes later, I walked down the aisle. My brother walked beside me, but I didn't rely on him to hold me up. I walked with my own weight, taking measured, deliberate steps toward the man who had loved me without conditions or price tags. When Arthur took my hand at the altar, he leaned in and whispered, "How do you feel, Light?" I replied softly. For the first time in 10 years, I feel completely light. We exchanged our vows in front of 50 guests who truly cared about us. There were no grand speeches about family obligations or sacrifices, just two people choosing to spend their remaining years in peace, respect, and mutual honesty. 2 months after the wedding, the dust began to settle. Julian's business went through a managed liquidation. They sold their luxury vehicles, downsized to a modest rental townhome, and Julian took a mid-level management position at an established logistics firm. It wasn't the glamorous life Vanessa had showcased on social media, but for the first time in their marriage, they were living on income they actually earned. The Bull Street guest cottage was cleared out. I didn't sell the property. Instead, I leased the cottage to a quiet visiting professor from the local university, generating a small, steady income stream that went directly into my retirement fund. Vanessa tried contacting me several times through relatives. She sent long letters detailing how difficult her new life was, how hard it was to adjust, and how I had destroyed her social standing in Savannah. I read every letter, but I didn't reply to the emotional bait. In month 3, a different letters arrived. It was short, written on plain notebook paper, without any accusations or pleas for money. Mom, Julian and I started court-mandated financial counseling last week. The counselor made us list every dollar we owed and where it came from. Seeing your name written next to $92,000 on a whiteboard made me sick. I thought I hated you for saying no at the rehearsal dinner. But sitting here looking at our real numbers, I realize I hated you because you stopped letting me pretend. I'm not asking for money. I know you changed the locks. I just wanted you to know I'm finally looking at the ledger. Vanessa. I folded the letter and placed it inside my desk drawer. I didn't call her back immediately. Real change isn't proven in a single letter. It's proven over years of quiet, unglamorous effort. But it was a start. Today, Arthur and I sit on the front porch of our Bull Street home, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through the oak trees. My $70,000 remains intact in its account, growing quietly, serving as the safety net Arthur and I built for our old age. We travel when we want to. We support local community restoration projects. And we live well within our means. People often ask me if I regret what happened at the rehearsal dinner, if I wish I had handled things privately, or if I feel guilty about exposing my daughter in front of 75 people. My answer is always the same: I didn't expose Vanessa. I simply stopped hiding her choices. When you spend years protecting people from the consequences of their actions, you aren't showing them love. You are teaching them that hurting you is free. You become an accomplice to your own mistreatment, mistaking your silence for endurance and your compliance for grace. Vanessa didn't change because I explained my feelings more eloquently. She changed because the money stopped. The excuses vanished, and the real world finally caught up to her. Setting a boundary isn't an act of revenge against the people you love. It is the moment you decide that your peace, your dignity, and your life have value too. I wiped the coffee off my face that night, walked out of that ballroom, and never looked back. And in doing so, I didn't just save my wedding day, I reclaimed my life.